Awesome, technology works. Okay, so I know this is a secular student alliance, but I'll ask anyway. How many of you people have ever had a debate over the existence of God? Show of hands. All right, as expected. How about evolution? How about morality? This is a little messy of a topic. All right,
kind of all the other debates evolve into.
Yeah, it really is. But morality is a messy topic. That's part of the reason I've included it today. So all of you guys are in the right place because, of course, my presentation is on what it says, common arguments and logical fallacies. There it is. So, yeah, this isn't exactly stimulating material, so to speak. It's not the kind of thing you can really sit down and read, like, oh, very interesting, I'll move on. So that's why I've created this presentation. It's really so you can have solid footing in these debates as opposed to, you know, when you start off debating, you're not quite really sure what the words mean or what someone else is going to be saying, and it's really hard to sort of get your footing. You almost feel like a magic carp doing a splash attack. So it's also for self-diagnosing your own arguments where you say, well, hang on, before I make this argument and make a total idiot of myself, am I using a bad argument or am I using a logical fallacy? It really helps to sort of self-diagnose yourself before you start talking to people. I think that's the big thing to take away right now. And really, it's just to give you better conversations because, you know, that's part of what it's kind of being, that's what's fun about being an atheist is you have these interesting conversations. Let's see. Is there a way to move this keyboard any closer? It's not.
Can we be your clicker?
You have a clicker?
I mean, I can be a clicker.
Oh, that's all right. We're going to start with logical fallacies simply because they're simpler and they are parts of these bad arguments I'll be talking about. First one is a false dichotomy, and of course this is a situation in which two options are presented when actually more exists, so hence the name. And you may have heard phrases like, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Of course, leaving out the middle ground, which says, I don't give a shit. Or, I'm sure many of you have heard this, life was either caused by God or random chance. One of those two. Pick one. You can't pick evolution, because that's bullshit. And so that's how it usually goes. But to see how this sort of comes up in conversation, can I have 2 volunteers to come up here? Raise your hands. Someone. Anyone. Great. And you. All right. So these are going to be our 3rd graders on the playground at school. And I want you, the bully, to punch you, the dork. Sorry. All right, now I'm your dad, and I come to you after you complain to me, and I say, son, you can either punch him back or take it like a little bitch. What are you going to do? And when you're confronted by someone who only gives you 2 options, it's really tempting to sort of just zone out and say, okay, I gotta pick one, I gotta pick one, I gotta pick one. And most people don't step back and say, well, hang on a minute, let me think about this, I'll get back to you. Because of course, in this case, it's maybe I'll tell the teacher. But when you're confronted by someone, it's like, it's kind of scary. So you guys can sit down, thank you very much. I should have done a little Milgram experiment. You just punched it. Sorry, yeah. This is probably my favorite logical fallacy because it comes up so often. Argument from ignorance. The formal definition comes in 2 parts, which says something is not disproven, therefore it's true. Second part is something is unproven, therefore it's not true. For example, you haven't disproved God, therefore God exists. You may have heard that one before. Another way to say it, or another example, is you haven't proved God, therefore God definitely doesn't exist, which some of you may have made that point previously. I'll explain why that's not actually a good point to make. And if I can get this mouse. How do I mouse? There. Hopefully this works. Oh, darn it.
Stupid Java. It's not even the most recent update.
Does anyone know how to fix this?
No.
No. Okay. Right.
Can't take notes.
Is there sound? There's no sound. Just like the question. Ooh. Sorry, yeah. Help me, Derek. Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
Why don't you repeat that question?
All right. It starts at here. So this is how argument from ignorance usually comes up, and it's explained by one of my favorite scientists.
Okay? That's what argument from ignorance is.
Oh, wait a minute.
Do I believe in UFOs or extraterrestrial visitors?
All right.
I'm not authorized to answer that question. Where shall I begin? UFO. First, remember what the U stands for in UFO. Now, there's a fascinating frailty of the human mind that psychologists know all about. And it's called argument from ignorance. And this is how it goes. You ready? Somebody sees lights flashing in the sky. They've never seen it before. They don't understand what it is. They say, a UFO. The U stands for unidentified. So they say, I don't know what it is. It must be aliens from outer space visiting from another planet. Well, if you don't know what it is, that's where your conversation should stop. You don't then say, it must be anything. Okay? That's what argument from ignorance is.
All right, so that's usually how it comes up, and you may hear people talk about, well, evolution can't be how we got here, so it must have been God. Well, it's like, okay, so if, say, evolution is wrong, the Big Bang Theory, all that stuff's wrong, that simply means we don't know. You don't then say, well, it must be God or Zeus or anything. So that's how it usually comes up, and this is the formal definition up here. An important distinction to make, though, is in this second part of it, which is X is unproven, therefore X is not true. For example, God has not been proven, which I think we can all sort of agree on, therefore God is not real. There's an important distinction to make, and it seems to be sort of in conflict with, for example, this Hitchens quote, which says, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Seems to make sense. And in explaining argument from ignorance, I like to use the analogy of a court system. So if you're on trial, the judge can rule one of three ways. They can rule guilty, not guilty, or innocent. And the key thing to remember is that not guilty is different from innocent. Not guilty means the prosecution has failed to make its case. You have not shown me that this person is guilty, hence not guilty. Innocent, however, means that not only has the prosecution failed to make its case, but the defendant has verified that they are in fact innocent. For example, here's his receipt from Walmart at the time, he couldn't have committed the murder. And so what this definition is saying that not guilty is different from innocent. Sure, if X is unproven, then there's no reason to believe it, but that doesn't mean you've disproved it. Like, for example, finding a contradiction between the traits of God's quality, or God's ability to speak, character. There's a great Tim Minchin line you may have heard is, alternative medicine has either been proved not to work or has not been proved to work. Two different things, and that's this important distinction in the second part of the definition of argument from ignorance. Shifting the burden of proof is kind of a fun one. So, what is the burden of proof? Well, the burden of proof is the obligation to justify your position. So, of course, the fallacy of shifting the burden of proof is putting the burden of proof on the wrong person. And to illustrate this, Bertrand Russell at one point came up with what he called Russell's teapot, or what is now called Russell's teapot, where he says, imagine that I tell you that there is a China teapot orbiting the sun in our solar system somewhere between Earth and Mars. Now, this teapot is so small that it cannot be seen with our telescopes, and we cannot detect its gravitational effects. There's no evidence that it exists. Is it my job to prove the teapot exists, or is it your job to prove that it doesn't exist? And this is a form of argument from ignorance that says, well, you can't disprove it, therefore it must be true. So, like if I tell you, unicorns exist, what do you tell me? Okay, what do you tell me?
Prove it.
Prove that they don't. You see how that works, and you see how that's fallacious, which is always fun when that comes up. Equivocation fallacy, not so much a fallacy that you see in practice, but it's still a formal logical fallacy, and it's kind of funny. Let's see. So an example of this is Derek is bright. Bright things give off light. Therefore, Derek will light up this dark room.
No.
If it were actually dark. There we go. And he doesn't.
Oh.
And so, yeah, sorry. And so the equivocation fallacy is using the same word or phrase to mean two different things in the same argument. In this case, bright meaning smart, and then in the next line, bright meaning luminescent. You may have heard this one is love exists, God is love, therefore God exists. Of course, when someone makes that argument, what they really mean is love, the emotion, exists. God is love, the supernatural thing. I'm not quite sure what they mean by that. Depends on who you talk to. Therefore, God exists. And of course, you can see why that doesn't make any sense. So that's equivocation, doesn't come up that much. Composition is another one that doesn't really come up. Composition fallacy is arguing that because the components of something have a certain property, therefore the entire thing must also have that certain property. This is a good one. The atoms of this can cannot be crushed between my two fingers, none of them. Therefore, it should be possible, or it should be impossible, for me to crush this can with my fingers.
Whoa.
I know, it's scary, right? So that's why we have the composition fallacy. Of course, that makes no sense. Shut up, Cam. Here's another one that sometimes gets employed in conversation is neurons are not conscious, therefore, how can the brain be the source of our consciousness? And you could also turn that around and say, well, none of the wires in a computer have any computational power, so why does a million wires have any computational power? And so that's composition fallacy. It usually does come up in conversations about consciousness in the brain and stuff like that. Etymology fallacy. Again, not one that really gets thrown around much these days, but still worth noting, which is asserting that the present day of meaning of a word should mirror its historical meaning or the meaning of its parts. One that I've heard Kent Hovind use, which is why his picture is up there, is universe. Comes from the parts uni and verse, which means single spoken sentence. So we live in a single spoken sentence, just like the Bible said. Isn't that nice? I don't know why this is convincing, but it's still kind of interesting that people bring this up, and so you can point out and say, hey, etymology fallacy. That's just kind of fun. Or this is a common one in debates about what it means to be an atheist. You say, well, atheism, not theism. Of course, that doesn't account for the fact that there are deists or pantheists. It's not just, well, if you're anything that's not a theist, you're an atheist. Maybe that's what the parts mean, but that's not what the word actually means. And so that's the etymology fallacy. Argument ad populum. I've been surprised how common this one is in talking to people, that people just don't understand that because a lot of people believe something, that doesn't make it true. I mean, a lot of people used to believe the earth was flat. That didn't make it true. Or here's a good one. If God doesn't exist, why do so many people believe in him? It's like, well, that doesn't prove that it's actually a thing. And again, I've been surprised how many people invoke this fallacy, actually. Red herring, not really a formal fallacy, but it still comes up a lot, which is essentially introducing an irrelevant topic that moves the conversation away from what you're talking about. Like if evolution were true, then rape would be morally permissible. Even if that's the case, that's not what we're talking about. That has nothing to do with whether or not evolution is true. Little thing that comes up. Straw man. This is a very important one because everyone does this. Everyone responds to a misrepresented or oversimplified position of their opponent. They say, just like they don't take the time to sit and think and say, okay, explain to me your position one more time just so I get it, then I'll respond. A lot of people just sort of dive into it and assume they know what the other person's talking about and that they're instantly, you're full of shit. I know what you're talking about, I've heard it before. And so some examples are, evolution says we evolved from monkeys, but why are there still monkeys? Of course, this is an oversimplified view of evolution. That's not what evolution actually says. It's a straw man, a fake target, if you will. Or here's one that a lot of atheists sometimes use is, God sends people to hell, therefore he's not loving. That is an oversimplified position, and it really does depend who you talk to. That may work on some people, depending on their view, but a lot of people have more complicated explanations for how that is, etc. And that gets interesting. So I encourage you to ask people what they mean before responding to it. The is-ought gap. Let's see. Make sure I keep up with my notes here. So this is actually a very fundamentally complicated and disturbing philosophical idea. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it's very interesting. I wish I could. I wish I knew all the details. Let's see. So the fallacy is jumping the gap. So what is this gap? It's the distinction between descriptive statements and what are called normative statements. An example of a descriptive statement is, I am going to get knee surgery. That describes what is the case. A normative statement is, I should get knee surgery. Normative statements describe what ought to be or what should be. So, of course, the fallacy, like I said, is jumping the is-ought gap. You may have heard that evolution says we ought to pass on our genes. Well, no, it doesn't. The statement of what is, we evolved through natural selection, has nothing to do with what we ought to do. And, you know, Christians that you argue with may say, well, you can't get an ought from an is, which is true. You can't get an ought from the is of atheism, because atheism and science and all these things simply describe what is the case. Oh yeah, but the problem is that you can't really get an ought from Christianity either. Think about what Christianity says. God exists, God wants this, that, and the other thing from us, God created the earth. These are all statements of what is the case, but not about what should be the case. You can tell me all this stuff, like, okay, God is this is that. It's like, okay, where's the ought? And so, of course, it's a very intractable problem in philosophy, but this is usually how it comes up. Here's another one that's also much more detailed than I can get into, both for time and because I'm not fully familiar with it. Subjective versus objective. And I'm going to preface this by saying that there is a huge gray area between what really are poles of a spectrum, subjective and objective. For example, psychology is definitely subjective in the sense that it is contingent upon minds, whereas it is a rigorous science, though. So it does have an objective contingent upon things and circumstances. It does have an objective component to it. So it's really hard to place things like psychology as subjective or objective. It's a very tricky problem, but I'm going to simplify it for right now. Let's see. So usually how this comes up is people will throw in the word objective into their argument to try and make it sound more just solid or more true. They'll say that God is objectively loving or something like that. But some examples of subjective qualities are value, beauty, and purpose. These are all dependent on minds. We don't know what it means to say something is valuable without someone, a subject, valuing it. So there is no such thing as objective value in that sense. Objective qualities, of course, are mass, length, and energy, etc. So that's that, which leads nicely into the definition of purpose. You may have heard Christians say, yeah, I know, that atheists can't have a purpose to their lives. Well, hang on a second. Purpose, and meaning for that matter, are subjective qualities that minds, subjects, assign to things. So of course, atheists can have a purpose, it's just not a God-given purpose. Side note, I actually have heard it argued that God has the objective viewpoint. So in that sense, you can have objective purpose only if you have God. But of course, God, a subject, can't have an objective viewpoint by definition. That's a little side note. Let's see. An example of how purpose as a quality exists is, imagine that I open the door to enter my house, and it closes behind me, but as it's closing, a rock is picked up by the wind and blown in the way and jams the door open. The purpose of that rock is not to hold the door open. That's just what it happens to be doing. But then if I come along and say, oh, perfect, I needed a doorstop, I leave it there, and I go, to carry my TV out or whatever, then the rock has a purpose. Nothing about the rock itself has changed, not its position, not its qualities, nothing. You couldn't measure it and find its purpose. But I have given it a purpose subjectively. And so that's what it means. If purpose were objective, then you could look at the rock and say, oh, what do you know, it has a purpose. But of course you can't do that. Another thing that people like to sort of throw into their arguments are the words objective and absolute, which makes it sound more solid. And these are not the same thing. So if you're talking about morality, as some of you apparently have been, you may find people talking about objective morality, they may find people talking about absolute morality. These two are very different things, but objective and absolute, these are words that just sort of sound good, and people like to mix and match them. It's like, yeah, it's objective, it's absolute, but they are very different things. So in the terms of morality, objective simply means independent of our opinions. Murder is wrong whether or not we think it's wrong. Whereas absolute means independent of circumstances. Murder is wrong, no matter, even if you're killing Hitler, would be an example of that. Let's see, any questions or comments so far?
Can you go back to the slide about, I don't remember what it is, but can you go back and I'll tell you when to stop? Go, I think, there was one about, you know what, I don't remember.
What was the picture?
It was something about, no, now that you called me, I completely forgot. I'll remember in a second though.
All right then. Moving on to common arguments. This is going to be fun. By the way, 2 bonus questions that are worth nothing. Who knows who this is right here?
William Lane Craig.
You didn't raise your hand, sir.
Oh, I just remembered. William Lane Craig.
Say what?
William Lane Craig.
Okay. Do you remember?
Yeah, so subjective versus objective.
Yeah.
For example, if we're talking about value, if we can agree on a definition of what makes something valuable, then can it become objective?
Yes. However, the definition of value is, I didn't actually write it down, but it's something like the desirability of a thing. And by that definition, you don't know what it means to say that it's desirable, independent of a mind, a subject desiring it. If you redefine value, how would you define value so it's objective?
Well, we could, for example, in a certain context, value would mean this. And then if we agree that value means this, we can objectively say whether this fits that definition of value to what extent.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that would make sense, but that is changing the definition of value.
Or it's just, well, the same word can have different meanings depending on the context.
That is true. It
Like-
does depend on your definition of value.
Okay.
So what logical fallacy do you think is the most dangerous for atheists to engage in?
Definitely straw man, because it's very easy to come off as an argumentative atheist, like, religion is suck and stuff like that, and it's very easy to misrepresent your opponents. And honestly, there are as many religions as there are people. Everyone's religion is different. You really have to take the time to sit down and think through your opponent's position, and that's something that a lot of atheists, unfortunately, don't do. Was there a question back there?
I was going to say about your objective slide. Couldn't you say if you're like talking to a solipsist, they could say, "I don't believe in objective reality." What response would you have to that?
Solipsism is tricky to respond to because,
Or even David Hume's idealism, right? Everything's an idea in the mind of God, even measurements or mass.
I've not really heard that argument made contemporarily,
Okay.
so I'm not quite sure actually. That's it. Second bonus question was, does anyone know what this is representing? Do you know what this argument is supposed to be? Yes. You didn't raise your... What's with this side of not raising hands? Pascal's wager. You said it too. Okay, good job. You win nothing. Yes, Pascal's wager. Let's see where I am. Essentially, it's asking the question, what if you're wrong, atheists? What if you're wrong? And of course, it's kind of a rhetorical question. Of course, if you're wrong, you go to hell. And the formal, very sort of technical way to represent this is expected value. How many of you remember in your algebra classes doing expected value calculations? All right, I'll remind you what it is. Expected value is essentially the average payout of a game, where if it's positive, you should pull the lever and play the slots if the payout on average is positive. If it's negative, you're going to be losing money as you play the game in perpetuity. And if it's zero, do whatever the hell you want. Waste time. And so what you can do is say, okay, what's the expected value of being an atheist versus a Christian? So if you're an atheist and God exists, I put a minus infinity. You basically lose everything forever. You're in hell. Worst possible. However, if you're an atheist and God doesn't exist, best case, you get maybe a finite life of the perks of atheism, like being able to go out and drink as much as you want. And I'm weighting this in favor of the atheist. You'll see why in a sec. If you're a Christian and God exists, you win everything. Forever. Heaven. However, if you're a Christian and God doesn't exist, worst case scenario, the drawbacks of a finite life of being a Christian, like you can't go out and get shit-faced drunk whenever you feel like. So even weighting it as heavily as I can for the atheist, and even saying that the probability of God is ridiculously small, you do the expected value calculation. The expected value of being an atheist is still minus infinity. Expected value of a Christian is plus infinity. And so the conclusion isn't that God exists, but that it's rational to believe in God and follow him because, well, the payout is plus infinity versus minus infinity. Of course, the problem with this argument is, that it can be used to essentially prove anything as long as there is either an infinite reward or an infinite punishment. as an example of this, the YouTuber Thunderfoot came up with a very amusing different argument that used the exact same method, which is, imagine that I tell you that in the time I've been talking, a light-speed rhino, bear with me, the light-speed rhino has come into existence outside and is now running about the roads. Now, if you get hit by that light-speed rhino, because of how relativity works, you will be stuck in that moment of pain forever. That may not be exactly how it works, but bear with me. So, the expected value of going outside is minus infinity, because if you get hit by that rhino, if you are wrong, you lose everything forever. But the expected value of staying inside is at best, or at worst, even if the rhino has like tiny little bit of chance of existing, you lose 1 life. So are you going to take the minus infinity, or are you going to take the minus 1 finite life? Of course, the rational choice would be to take the minus 1 life, as opposed to the minus infinity. But of course, no one actually would say, yes, okay, I'll stay inside, because there's a light-speed rhino outside. Pascal's wager can be used to prove pretty much anything, as long as the expected value of believing it is higher than not. And Pascal's wager really is simply a way to avoid the argument and say, well, I'm just going to threaten you, because what if you're wrong? So, and that's how it usually comes up. Arguments from relativity are, yes?
Do you think Pascal's wager is also a red herring, in the sense that it doesn't really say whether it's true or not, but just the outcome of whether it's true or not?
Yeah, I think that would be fair to say. Let's see. Arguments from relativity are fun and they're slippery. They're basically saying that there must be an absolute standard for things like good or perfect in order for these words to mean anything. And we'll say, like, there must be an absolute standard right here, and that is God. He is the most perfect, and He's the most good, and that's why we have words like perfect or good. We can say that one thing is better than another. Well, here's the thing. There's 2 things wrong with this. The first thing is really funny, which is, you could also argue for this reference point, couldn't you? In order to say that something is bad, or worse than something else, shouldn't there be a most bad thing, or a most stupid thing? You could make the argument for an anti-God, as it were. So you don't have to define the good, you could also define the bad. Either one can be your zero. Of course, the more fundamental problem with this is that we don't compare things to an absolute zero of qualities. We compare them to each other. My car isn't rusty as compared to the most rusty car I could ever think of. It's rusty as compared to maybe that car, how it was before. So this isn't even how we reason about these words. We don't need this zero that is supposed to be God. Let's see. Oh man, ontological arguments. Yeah, these fortunately have fallen out of favor, at least in terms of what I've been hearing, but they basically go something like this. It's a very fancy way to try and define God into existence. It says, God is the greatest possible being, or the most perfect being. God exists in our minds. A being that exists both in our minds and the real world is greater than a being that only exists in our minds. Therefore, in order for God to be the greatest possible being, He must exist in reality as well as our minds. Therefore, God exists. Let's see. Now, of course, the problem that I'm sure probably jumped out at you is that this uses really ambiguous words like great or perfect, which of course haven't been defined. What do you mean when you say that God is greatest? Do you mean He's the smartest? Do you mean He's the most physically attractive? I don't know. And it's just it's a very intuitive argument that says, well, it's better to exist. As if, a human being, a conscious human being is better than a rock. Well, by what standard? What do you mean, better? And that's a big problem with this argument. It uses those same words over and over again. Second thing is that God does not exist in our minds. His infinite wisdom is not in here. Only my perception of His infinite wisdom. If you say that, for example, let's see I'm remembering a green stapler I had once. The green stapler isn't in my mind. There's no green here. There are no staples in here. But there's my impression of the stapler. So it is an equivocation fallacy to say that God exists. He exists as a concept in let's see, premise 2. But then in premise 3 and 4, He exists as a being of some kind, which are 2 different things. And like I said at the beginning, it really is a fancy way of saying God exists by definition, because He's defined to exist. Like I said, I don't hear it very often, but it's still funny when it comes up. Moral arguments. These get messy. I wish I could talk more about them, but that would get messy. See, William Lane Craig used to be or still is, I haven't checked up on him, a fan of this top argument, which is, if God exists, then objective moral obligations exist. Objective moral obligations do exist, therefore God must exist. And I like to turn this around on him and say, okay, how about this? If Zeus exists, lightning exists. Lightning does exist, therefore Zeus exists. So you can see how this is really almost just an argument from ignorance. Like, we don't know where it came from, objective moral obligations, therefore it must have been God. Okay, and the other one is a little better in terms of how difficult it is to debunk. It's an argument from normativity. It basically says moral oughts, statements about what should be, like, I ought not run over cars, or over people with my cars. Run over cars. I want a monster truck. So moral oughts exist. The best explanation for these is God. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that God exists. Note that this is not a deductive argument that says, therefore we're railroaded into the conclusion that God exists, but it's saying, inference to the best explanation, it's probable that God exists. And it's essentially the claim, like I talked about before, that says, well, atheists are jumping the is-ought gap. You can't get an ought from an is. And of course, like I explained before, there's nothing about any worldview, really, that says what ought to be the case. And that's kind of what's fundamentally disturbing about the is-ought gap, is you can say what is all day long, but why should that translate into what ought to be the case? Even, let's say the statement, if I want to stay out of jail, I ought not run over people with my car. Well, wait a minute. Who said that I ought to fill my desires, or to fulfill my desires? And it is a very interesting problem that I'm unfortunately not familiar with in that depth. Cosmological argument. Again, for those of you who know William Lane Craig, this is his calling card. This is his thing he loves to do. And the argument goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. This is sometimes called the prime mover argument. In fact, how many of you were at Ask an Atheist Day last year? That one guy who was going around arguing with everyone, did you hear him use this kind of arguments? Does anyone remember that? Yeah. All right. That was it.
It's one of the proofs of what? Aquinas?
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas, yeah.
A few of Aquinas' arguments all sounded alike. Let's see. So first off is the idea that the universe began to exist. Now what do we mean when we say something begins to exist? A prerequisite for what we mean is it begins to exist in time. This can began to exist as a crushed can when I crushed it. And of course the word when means in time. There was a time t1 and then there was time t2, uncrushed, crushed. But in that sense, the universe has always existed. As long as there has been a universe, there has been time. In other words, time did come into existence with the universe. So you really can't say that the universe began to exist, at least not in the way that we mean begin to exist. So that's a big problem right off the bat. Let's see. And there's also equivocation with the phrase begin to exist, where, let's see, in premise 1 it says everything that begins to exist has a cause, which means begins to exist, again, in time and out of previously existing material. Everything that we bring into existence or that comes into existence has something that it comes out of, like a sculpture comes out of a block of marble. There's something that was reworked. Whereas in premise 2, assuming that God made the universe, he didn't make it begin to exist in time. He didn't make it begin to exist out of any previous material. So how can you say that the phrase begin to exist means the same thing in both of these cases? And those are the two big problems with, oh, yeah.
So I think the most important thing about this argument is that you can always turn it around about God.
I'm sorry?
You can always turn this argument around about God, that God began to exist, so like that has to be something that created God.
And that's something that often happens in conversations, and it depends who you talk to, where that ends up going. A lot of things happen with that. Here's a good one, actually. This is one that is one of my more favorite arguments to use, and I encourage you to use it and try it out, see what happens, because everyone's view is different. But I think it really should come back to the same question here. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma, and it's an argument against biblical morality that states, is something good because God commands it, or does God command something because it is good? If something is good because God commands it, well then good is simply a synonym for God said so. It's not that it reduces suffering or increases pleasure or sends people to heaven. It's just God said to do it. That's what I mean when I say good. Nothing to do with making people's lives any better. However, if God commands something because it's good, well then, God really isn't the source of morality. He's simply the messenger. Something else has determined what is good and bad, and God is telling us what is good and bad. And the reason this is a problem is because most Christians will contend, no, God is the source of morality. He is the standard. And a typical answer to this dilemma, case A or B, they'll say, well, no, that's a false dilemma. There's a third option, which is neither. Something is good because it reflects God's nature. God's nature is one of love, therefore love is good. God's nature is one of compassion, therefore compassion is good, etc. So that's the first response. And this, oh yeah.
Well, with B, you say that it's just the messenger, like, then there's another source for the good.
Uh-huh.
Well, let's say that I make fantastic tacos, and I tell people to make tacos like I do. I'm still the source of tacos.
Well, yeah, you're telling people to make tacos, but you're
So I'm
also
the messenger and the creator of tacos.
So when they make the tacos, don't they make the tacos? You're just telling
Yeah.
people to make good tacos.
There
But I'm
you
the
go.
source of the
So
tacos.
you're God.
You're the source of how to make the tacos, but not the tacos themselves they make.
Let's say that I'm also responsible
Sorry,
for
how-
making all the tacos.
Can you phrase it?
So you make all the
Yeah,
good
can you
tacos.
phrase it more analogous to that?
Yeah, I'm having trouble.
Okay,
putting
you
my
said,
finger on it.
does God command something because it's good? Then that says that God tells you to do something good, but good came from someplace else.
I'm sorry? You mean
Well-
part A?
Well, for B.
Oh, for B. Yeah, God commands something because it's good. Is that?
Well, then you also said, well, that doesn't say that good comes from God, that good comes from someplace else.
Okay.
I've just kind of just point out perhaps a counter argument that you could be both the messenger and the creator of.
Okay, but does God simply, let's see,
How did you determine the taco worked good?
yeah, we told you.
How is good objective before?
I also create objectivity.
Are the tacos good because you created
I'm having
them?
trouble
Or are
sort
they
of
good
understanding
because
the
they're
the
good?
analogy here.
Yeah, the word
Well,
because
but what if
is
someone
the
doesn't
word
like
that
tacos?
here.
Preston, what if someone made those
Everybody
tacos
loves
without you
tacos.
telling
Well,
them?
Franklin
redefined value to be Preston's tacos, and then they went from there. I think we've gotten off track. Let's return.
As the creator of tacos, I also create the axioms of the taco universe.
Sounds like
And,
a conversation for Murphy's.
Alright.
Oh, yeah.
Alright, back on track. Interesting though. They'll say neither something is good simply because it reflects God's nature, but that simply puts the dilemma into different terms. You simply ask, okay, did God dictate his own nature, or was God's nature determined by something else? And again, if case A, God dictated his own nature, well at the same time he's dictating what is good and what is bad. So good is just a synonym for God dictated it, with the middleman being God's nature. Of course, and then if something else dictated God's nature, well then God isn't really the source of morality. This thing used God to set morality. And so they'll say, okay, well, neither. God's nature is the way it is out of necessity, which is kind of a fuzzy word to use. But again, necessity is a subjective thing. What is doing the necessitating? You can't say that something is necessary independent of something needing it to be that way. We don't know what it means for something to be necessary, again, independent of something needing it. What's doing the needing? And you could just rephrase the dilemma again, does God need it to be this way, or does something else need it to be this way? And you get to the same dilemma over and over again. And like I said, I encourage you to try this out because different people have different responses, but I'm willing to bet that it's always going to come back to a simple rephrasing of the argument. And I believe that's the end. Any remaining questions about anything? Okay.
Yeah, did anyone else go to this thing? It was it was advertised in our email. It was yesterday. The talk by Dr. Kenneth Howell. Is God good enough for me? I know Neil went and John went. Sam went and I was there.
I saw the billboard.
That's all I saw. Yeah. I think that's the only news.
What was that about?
Well, okay, so
Now we're too long.
Well, so they did this talk at the Newman Center that was, "Am I good enough for God?" And they decided that wasn't a big enough circle jerk, so they decided that the next time they would do, "Is God good enough for me?" And I walked in there thinking like, all right, maybe they're going to try to justify like slavery or one of those other things, like it's going to be good. So we show up there, and Dr. Howell immediately takes the question, "Is God good enough for me?" and splits it into two different questions. One, he says, is the, let's see, not the seasoned seeker, but the inquirer, I guess. He says the inquirer starts off wondering, I don't know anything about this Christian religion. And do I really need it? Is God good enough for me? And proceeded to ignore that question entirely, because that leads to things like slavery and and killing people for no reason.
How do you ignore that?
And then he splits it into another half where he says the seasoned seekers, the people who already have a spiritual side, but really want to delve into it, and they ask, "Is God enough for me?" And he proceeded on that line of argument for about an hour, obviously removing the word "good" from the question and thereby changing its meaning entirely.
So like, is God emotionally enough for me? Is that?
Yeah.
In the absence of wealth and comfort and love.
Yeah.
God alone.
That is basically, you can't be God.
So I was wondering, just based on that brief summary, where you think that might fit into some of the logical fallacies that...
well, that sounds like a red herring to me. Ignoring something and going to something else.
Platter of red herring. Over and over.
Don't eat
and
red
over.
herrings.
It's kind of like a red herring taco.
The best red herring.
Yeah.
Did you remember the slide that you wanted me to...
Oh, that was my value subjective versus objective question.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yes.
You brought up the point, like what do you say, etymology fallacy, that atheism does just because it's atheism doesn't mean we should go on that line of arguing. At least Matt Dillahunty, I know he runs the Atheist Experience show, right? He frequently says on the show, like, that's his line of argument, that it doesn't tell you anything about the person's moral positions, and that's probably perhaps why people are now starting this like atheism plus movement and things like that. So they have some moral component in addition to just rejecting the claim of God.
Yeah, that's something I've heard before, which is, atheism, you may as well define yourself to be a non-Loch monsterist, not Loch Ness monsterist. That simply tells you what you don't believe, but it doesn't give you a handle on who you are or what you think. It's just this one thing that isn't part of your worldview.
But on the other hand, it's somewhat useful, because when people are trying to say things about like what atheists believe, or they're portraying us, maybe not literally as baby eaters, but something to that effect. You just say, look, atheist, all it means is I have a lack of belief in a God, which is what the word technically means. There are a lot of different, more specific qualities that you could say fit under maybe the umbrella term not believing in a God. But it's still useful to have that and be able to say that when people try to make a blanket statement about a group of non-religious people as a whole.
Yeah, that's true. I still think the word atheist is useful, of course, because it's like, what's your take on religion? What's your religion or what's your take on religion? It's like, well, I don't. So, I'm not one of those people who thinks that we should ditch the word, though. Does anyone think we should ditch the word atheism?
Atheism or atheist?
Atheism.
I do. Tell us, Phil.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as atheism. What is the second tenet of your atheism?
Well, I think the suffix atheism simply refers to a person who believes X or not.
Atheist.
Should we ditch atheism?
No. I love that word.
Well, yeah.
I don't know. There's not a tremendous use for it. I try to not throw labels out there.
Humanism has a set of beliefs. Jainism has a set of beliefs.
Yeah.
Every ism has a set of beliefs. Atheism not have a set of beliefs.
Well, you could argue that one of the beliefs is that the case for God hasn't been made, but I don't know. That's interesting. Any other questions about the presentation? All right. I think I did a good job then.